Let me tell you something, boss. If you think a modern medical center is a creepy place to draw a late-night paycheck, you wouldn't last 10 minutes in the sub-basement of an old university hospital back in the early 70s. Those places weren't built for comfort, they were constructed like heavy industrial bunkers, with thick limestone foundations and retrofitted infrastructure that felt more like a steamship engine room than a place for human healing. My name is Arthur, I was just 25 years old, and my official title on the county payroll was night hatch fastener. It sounds like a fancy administrative position, but the reality was pure, heavy muscle work. I was responsible for the third-tier isolation bank, an ancient, wall-mounted matrix of dead storage vaults dating back to the late 1920s. These weren't those sleek, individual stainless steel drawers you see in modern slide-out coolers. These were massive, vertical iron hatches, built right into the stone wall like bread ovens, held shut by heavy, solid brass levers and double-jointed locking bars that required you to throw your entire body weight into them just to get the latch to engage. The cooling system wasn't electrical either, boss. It was a massive, centralized ammonia absorption plant located 2 floors below the trench. It didn't hum, it gave off a continuous, low-frequency hiss, a heavy, mechanical respiration that vibrated the concrete floorboards and filled the corridors with the faint, biting sting of chemical frost. The air down there was always sub-zero, the kind of dry, administrative cold that gets into your ribs and turns your breath into gray soot before it even leaves your teeth. You had to wear 2 layers of heavy wool socks and an industrial canvas apron just to keep from freezing to the stone. The frost didn't just sit on the metal surfaces, it grew in thick, crystalline feathers along the iron seams, constantly threatening to choke the manual levers if you didn't stay ahead of it with the scrapers. "Keep the seals tight, Arthur," the evening supervisor told me before he punched out at 11. The old ammonia lines are prone to pressure spikes when the university cuts the main boilers for the night. If a hatch isn't fully fastened, the vacuum drops, and the frost lines will split wide open. My routine was simple but exhausting. Every 2 hours, I had to walk the zinc line with a heavy, lead-weighted rubber mallet and a canister of industrial tallow grease. I had to check each of the 24 brass handles, clearing away the white needle frost that grew along the rubber gaskets and slamming the iron levers down until the steel safety pins dropped into their guide slots with a definitive, mechanical ring. It was tedious, bone-chilling work that left my knuckles raw and my ears ringing from the constant pressure of the central plant. The walls were lined with old ceramic tiles that had cracked and yellowed from decades of chemical exposure, reflecting the dim glare of the overhead incandescent bulbs in greasy, distorted shapes. By the time the clock on the wall crept toward 2:45 a.m., the storm outside had turned into a full-blown Pennsylvania cloudburst, the heavy rain driving down through the street-level coal chutes and rattling the rusty ventilation pipes overhead. The water was pooling near the limestone foundations, dripping down the damp brickwork in rhythmic, hollow splashes that echoed through the empty corridors. I was sitting at my small metal desk near the intake ramp, scraping the grease out of my fingernails with a bone-handled pocket knife, when the continuous hiss of the ammonia line suddenly died down to a complete, suffocating silence. The change in the room wasn't visual, boss, it was a total drop in atmospheric weight. The low-frequency vibration in the concrete floorboards cut out like a generator being disconnected from the main grid, leaving nothing but the hollow, ringing silence of a sealed vault. The air became completely stationary, freezing my breath mid-air into a thick, gray cloud that didn't drift or fade. I stood up, my work boots clicking loudly against the stone as I picked up my flashlight and the rubber mallet. I walked over to Vault 14, the heavy, double-wide hatch where they kept the unidentified floaters from the local river canals. The iron door was covered in a thick, normal layer of white needle frost, but as I reached out to check the main brass locking bar, I noticed something that made my stomach turn completely cold. The white frost around the brass handle was melting, turning into a thin, greasy stream of warm water that was dripping down onto the concrete floorboards in a steady, unnatural rhythm. The The melting frost wasn't a mechanical failure of the ammonia loop, boss. It was a localized reversal of the temperature profile that defied every standard operating procedure in the logbook. I stood there, holding the lead-weighted rubber mallet tight in my left hand, watching the clear water run down the waxy, black surface of the iron hatch. The air in the sub-basement corridor was still freezing cold, enough to turn my breath into thick, stagnant gray clouds that hovered over the zinc line like grease, but when I drew closer to Vault 14, the sharp, medicinal smell of carbolic acid was completely gone. It was replaced by a thick, heavy humidity that tasted like wet laundry starch, boiled wool, and old river steam. It was the kind of hot, pressurized dampness that instantly coats your lungs and makes your skin prickle with a greasy sweat beneath your clothes. I reached out with my bare right hand, my fingers approaching the massive, double-jointed brass lever that secured the bulkhead. By all accounts of physics, that metal should have been sub-zero, cold enough to tear the skin clean off my palms if they were wet. But the moment my flesh made contact with the polished brass, a shock of dry, human heat radiated straight into my hand. The handle was warm, not lukewarm like an old steam pipe, boss, but burning warm like the forehead of a man running a high fever in a packed, unventilated hospital ward. It was sweating, too. A dense, oily layer of condensation was bubbling out of the microscopic pores of the brass casting, forming tiny, greasy beads that sizzled faintly as they ran down into the rusted guide slots of the locking bar. The metal was actively breathing out a fine, warm water vapor that condensed against my cold canvas apron, turning the heavy fabric damp, limp, and smelling of ancient river mud. "What the hell is wrong with the insulation?" I muttered, my voice sounding flat and small against the wet limestone walls, completely swallowed by the unnatural lack of the ammonia plant's hiss. Before I could even adjust my grip to pull the lever down and secure the safety pin, a sound erupted from inside Vault 14. It wasn't the loose bracket of a transport gurney or a shifting zinc tray, boss. It was a heavy, dull, concussive blow, the unmistakable sound of an immense weight slamming directly against the interior sheet iron lining of the door. Thump. The impact was so violent the 3-inch brass locking bar vibrated against the alignment pin, sending a sharp, stinging metallic shock straight up my arm that made my elbow click. But it didn't stop with Vault 14. Before the echo could even fade into the distant corners of the cellar, another identical impact hit from Vault 15. Then Vault 16. Then Vault 17. Within 10 seconds, the entire 24-door zinc matrix was shaking. It wasn't a random series of muscle spasms or post-mortem settling from a bad batch of floaters, boss. It was a perfectly synchronized, rhythmic cadence. Every single iron hatch along the wall was being struck from the inside out at the exact same millisecond, as if the 24 corpses inside had all coordinated their remaining weight to push against the seals in unison. Asterisk thump. Thump. Thump asterisk. The cadence matched the heavy pounding of the rain against the coal chutes outside, but the force behind it was hydraulic, immense, and completely unaligned with any rule of decay I'd ever learned on this shift. The solid iron doors were bowing outward against the brass levers, the heavy rivets groaning under a pressure that felt like it was being generated by an entire ward of living men trying to punch their way through the stone wall. The ancient concrete floorboards beneath my boots began to vibrate, the oil pools and the drainage channel ripples in perfect, geometric circles. I backed away toward my desk, my work boots skidding through the warm water that was now pooling across the floor. The single yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling began to shrink down to a dull orange thread, the shadows in the corners of the room expanding like long black fingers reaching toward the zinc line. I grabbed my iron wrench from the supply tray, my hands shaking so hard the tool clattered against the metal casing. The administrative silence of the room had turned into a living, muted roar, the sound of 24 iron hatches vibrating against their alignment pins with a mechanical force that was slowly working the brass handles upward toward the release position. The vibration of those brass handles wasn't a loose fit, boss. It was a deliberate, jointed lever action that was forcing the 3-inch iron bars out of their guide slots inch by inch. I stood in the center of the floorboards, the lead-weighted mallet clutched in my left hand while my right held the iron wrench, watching the entire line of vaults reset their alignment pins simultaneously. The sound of the safety catches disengaging ran down the limestone wall like a string of firecrackers going off inside a deep tomb. Asterisk click. Click. Click, asterisk. Then, right at the stroke of 3, the synchronized thumping stopped instantly. The sudden transition from deafening noise to absolute quiet hit my eardrums with a painful, dry pop that tasted like raw copper on the back of my tongue. The silence was total, boss, the kind of plugged, heavy quiet that hits a boiler room right before the main steam header splits wide open. The single orange thread of the light bulb filament stayed dim, casting long, distorted shadows of the locking bars across the ceiling joists like the ribs of an old shipwreck. I forced my boots forward, my knees popping with a dull friction as I approached Vault 14 again. The warm water pooling around the iron legs of the wall frame was smoking now, a thick, silver-gray vapor rising from the floorboards that smelled heavily of wet slate, sulfur, and 80 years of stagnant river dampness. I stood directly in front of the double-wide hatch, my breath forming a slow, gray soot cloud that hovered over the brass lever. The handle was no longer just sweating, the oily moisture was bubbling out of the keyhole in thick, geometric veins that ran down the waxy iron plate. Then, from the tiny air seam between the rubber gasket and the limestone frame, the sound started. It wasn't a mechanical hiss from the ammonia plant, boss, and it wasn't the sound of escaping gas from a decomposing floater. It was a long, slow, vacuously deep intake of human breath, the sound of a pair of dry, leathery lungs expanding under a massive weight, drawing the freezing carbolic air of the prep room straight through the steel seal with a wet, whistling rattle that shook the glass globe of my flashlight. Ha! The vacuum inside the vault was reversing, drawing the air in first, then expanding outward with a terrible weight. As the breath hit the bottom of the intake cycle, the 3-inch brass locking bar on Vault 14 didn't just rattle, it began to lift. Slowly, mechanically, with the steady, hydraulic leverage of an engine piston, the heavy brass handle rose out of its lower seat. The iron latch clicked as it cleared the safety lip, the double-jointed hinge groaning as a force from the deep interior began to push the 4-inch insulated bulkhead open from the inside out, as if a dead hand was calmly executing the release protocol from the dark. The thick rubber seal began to peel away from the limestone casing with a sticky, tearing sound, and the silver-gray vapor inside the vault began to swirl greedily toward the gap. It felt like the room itself was being hollowed out, a sudden, violent displacement of atmosphere that pulled the very warmth from my skin. I stood paralyzed, watching the bulkhead creak open just a fraction more, revealing not a tray of cold, still flesh, but a void of absolute, light-swallowing darkness that hummed with the high-frequency vibration of 1,000 dying machines. A long, skeletal finger, bleached the color of old parchment and tipped with jagged, obsidian-hard nail, reached out from the gloom to grip the edge of the cooling frame, anchoring itself to the metal with such force that the heavy steel door shuddered under the strain, and I realized with a sickening thud in my chest that the protocol didn't just govern the storage of the dead. It was a seal for something that had been waiting for the exact right moment to clock back into work, and my shift had just become a permanent, living nightmare. The movement of that brass lever wasn't a gradual drift, boss, it was a firm, deliberate upward sweep that indicated a massive mechanical intent behind the iron plating. I stood rooted to the spot, the silver-gray vapor swirling around my work boots like liquid mercury, stinging my skin with a caustic, acidic bite. The single light bulb overhead flickered once, the orange filament dying down to a needle-thin point before returning with a dull, oily glare that highlighted the white frost forming on the edges of the open latch, a frost that seemed to be pulsing like veins of ice. The entire room felt like it was tilting backward, drawn down into the earth by the weight of that breaking seal, a crushing, subterranean gravity that threatened to liquefy my very marrow. The 4-inch thick insulated door of Vault 14 broke its seal with a wet, heavy, sickening thud that sounded like a blunt shovel hitting packed river mud and pulverized cartilage. A thick, concentrated blast of that sweltering, laundry steam heat hit me square in the chest, tearing through the wool of my work shirt and leaving a layer of hot, greasy, suffocating condensation across my skin that stung like liquid fire. It didn't make sense, boss. The thermometers on the central line were reading well below zero, but the draft pouring out of that vault felt like the exhaust from a hellish, pressurized steel foundry. The moisture instantly hit my face, smelling of stagnant, rotted canal water and the nauseating, chalky stench of lime pits where bodies go to be unmade. "Get back in the tray," I choked out, my voice sounding flat and hollow against the masonry, though my hands wouldn't cooperate enough to raise the rubber mallet, pinned to my sides by a paralyzing, leaden dread. My jaw was locked tight from the pressure shift, muscles spasming until I feared my teeth would shatter, and my skin felt raw, as if the air itself was scouring the pores from my face. Through the narrow, 3-inch gap of the unlatched door, the internal phosphorescence began to spill into the corridor. It wasn't standard light, it was a faint, silver-gray glow that turned the sulfur vapor into a network of fine, vibrating, predatory threads connecting Vault 14 directly to the adjacent hatches, stitching the architecture of the dead together. The zinc transport gurney inside was stationary, but the heavy white linen shroud covering the river vagrant was twitching. The fabric wasn't fluttering from a draft, it was being drawn taut, the outline of the corpse's jaw and ribcage pushing up against the coarse cloth with a rigid, unnatural, violent tension, the bones snapping and grinding beneath the fabric as if the skeleton itself had turned to magnetic iron and was trying to claw its way out of its own rot. From the deep interior of the vault matrix, the multi-layered voice returned, vibrating through the iron conduits like jagged glass scraping against waterlogged wood. It didn't use the room's air, boss. It rattled the metal plates of the desk and the trays until the dental instruments began to chatter in their jars, dancing with a frenzied, demonic rhythm of impending slaughter. Asterisk, the line is open, Arthur. The fasts are down. You can't turn the pins against the current tonight. Let the cold meat drop into the lower drift. Asterisk. Before the collective rasp could finish the sentence, Vault 15's brass lever gave a loud, metallic, ear-splitting snap. The iron safety pin sheared straight through its guide slot like a bullet, and the second door swung wide, slamming against the limestone wall with a concussive force that vibrated through my very teeth, sending a wave of cracked mortar powder raining down onto my shoulders like the debris of a tomb being forced open. The silver web on the ceiling was forming its circuit, glowing with a malevolent, pulsating intensity, and the center of the floorboards was starting to lurch, the concrete screaming as it twisted. The physical gravity of the room was shifting toward the open darkness of the walls, pulling the warm water on the floorboards into a slow, circular whirlpool around the alignment frames, a drain that didn't lead to pipes, but straight into the gullet of an abyss that was hungrily waiting to tear the soul from my ribs. The structural lurch of the floorboards wasn't a minor tremor, boss. The solid concrete foundation was bowing down toward the center drain as if the space beneath the sub-basement was emptying out into a throatless, insatiable gullet. I forced my numb, heavy legs to move, my boots skidding through the waxy, blood-slicked ice that was already beginning to form over the hot, sulfurous water pools. I dropped the rubber mallet and grabbed my 16-inch iron pipe wrench from the tool belt, my palms raw and blistered from the sudden, agonizing transition between the burning, feverish handles and the lung-searing, freezing air. The weight of the atmosphere had doubled, making every step feel like I was wading through deep, unyielding, suffocating river silt that wanted to pull me into the foundations. I lunged at Vault 14, jamming the hardened steel teeth of the wrench over the base of the rising, screeching brass lever. I threw my entire torso over the handle, using the jagged, crumbling stone wall as a backrest to gain maximum, desperate leverage against the abyssal, internal force that was relentlessly trying to push the bulkheads wide open, tearing the very integrity of the morgue apart. "You ain't breaking the county ledger!" I screamed, my voice cracking, my lungs burning and liquefying from the concentrated, caustic ammonia fumes that were now leaking from the fractured, hissing seals like the breath of a dying god. The resistance inside the hatch was like trying to manually turn the flywheel of a dead, rusted locomotive made of human bone. The brass lever groaned under the pressure of my wrench, the metal structural rods of the wall frame bending 45 degrees, screaming in a high-pitched, metallic agony as the internal weight pushed back with the force of an oncoming train. Through the gap in the door, the silver-gray light turned into a brilliant, drilling, malicious glare that focused straight onto my eyes, boring into my retinas like hot needles, casting long, skeletal, twitching shadows of my hands across the ceiling joists. It was a cold, piercing light that felt like a rusty needle driving deep into my skull, methodically trying to short-circuit the nerves in my brain and scramble my consciousness into static. The linen shroud of Case 112 was extending through the crack now, the stiff, brittle white fibers turning rigid as wire rods, pulsating with a rhythmic, parasitic life as they reached for the wrench handle with terrifying, grasping intelligence. The touch of that fabric wasn't soft, boss. It felt like frozen, abrasive canvas that was tightening with the hydraulic, bone-crushing power of an industrial, mindless crane. The threads wrapped around the cold iron tool, their waxy, rotting texture sizzling faintly against the bare metal as they pulled back with a jarring, brutal strength toward the pitch-black, stinking void of the vault tray. The dual-pulsed piston rhythm inside the floor drain erupted again, vibrating through the limestone floorboards, a heartbeat of pure, crushing machinery. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The sound was right beneath my feet now, the iron drain cover rattling and slamming against its seat like an unvented, possessed valve on a sinking steamship. Every time the invisible, titanic piston completed a stroke, the brass lever in my hands gained another notch of resistance, the steel teeth of my wrench stripping the polished brass coating away in fine, glittering, sharp flakes that hissed and vanished as they hit the ice. My fingers were locked into stiff, white, bloodless knots around the handle, my tendons popping and muscles tearing under the immense, godless strain as I fought to keep the zinc line from collapsing into the dark, watching in terror as my own skin began to purple and darken, the cold of the vault turning my very blood into sludge even as the ammonia fire charred my lungs from the inside out. My heart thrashed against my ribs like a trapped bird, each frantic beat echoing the metallic grinding of the floor, and I could feel the cold, unnatural fingers of the dead drifting through the gap, their touch a necrotic blight that promised to turn my living flesh into the same gray, waxen ruin currently struggling to claw its way out of the iron tomb. The wrench teeth finally gave up, slipping across the scarred brass lever with a high-pitched, bone-jarring screech that set my teeth on edge and sent shivers of pure terror down my spine. The metal was too slick with that foul, oily sweat, and my strength was nothing compared to the hydraulic pressure thrashing on the other side of the bulkhead. The lever kicked upward, catching my knuckles and throwing me backward into the freezing, wet slush of the floor. My back hit the brickwork with a dull, sickening thud that shattered my breath, and I watched, helpless, as the massive iron door of Vault 14 swung wide open on its heavy, weeping hinges, groaning like a dying animal. There wasn't a body inside, boss. Not in the way you'd expect a transport tray to be occupied by a river floater. The interior of the vault was an empty, black vertical shaft that dropped down into the bowels of the building, a dark, perfectly circular bore cut straight through the bedrock, lined with the same aged ceramic tiling as the cellar walls. There was no back wall to the locker. It was a chute, ancient and impossibly deep, smelling of deep earth ozone and things that hadn't seen the sun in a century. The silver-gray vapor wasn't just leaking out, it was being pulled out, a thick, swirling, suffocating vortex of fog that wrapped around the open door frame like a living, strangling curtain. The sound that followed wasn't the rhythmic thumping anymore. It was a wet, heavy, ravenous slurping noise, like a deep-sea suction pump engaging in a pool of hot mud and liquefied viscera. Asterisk slurp. Slurp. Slurp asterisk. Something was climbing up that shaft. I scrambled to my feet, my work boots slipping on the slick, black condensation, and grabbed the iron drain cover I'd pried up earlier. It was heavy, cast iron, and cold as the grave, but it felt like the only solid thing in a room that was losing its grip on reality. I didn't wait to see what was pulling itself up from the dark. I swung the cover with every ounce of panic-fueled adrenaline I had left, slamming it onto the open edge of the tray where the inner chute met the wall, trying to wedge it as a barricade against the encroaching nightmare. The impact vibrated up my arms and into my chest, a deep, resonant clang that echoed off the high ceiling like a funeral bell. For a second, the slurping stopped, replaced by a tense, heavy silence that felt like the intake of breath before a kill. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs, a desperate, erratic rhythm that felt completely out of sync with the cellar's atmosphere. I stared at the dark hole of the vault, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand, desperately trying to pierce the gloom. The silver light from the interior wasn't dying, it was pulsing, getting brighter with every frantic heartbeat, casting long, writhing shadows against the back wall that looked like fingers, hundreds of them, elongated, spindly, and tipped with needle-sharp claws, clawing their way upward toward the rim of the chute with a frantic, desperate hunger that made my skin crawl and my gut twist in pure, unadulterated revulsion. "I'm just the night man," I whispered, the words tumbling out of my mouth before I could catch them. "I'm just here to tighten the pins." "You don't want me. You want the boiler room 2 levels down." The response didn't come in words, boss. It came as a sudden, violent, bone-rattling shift in the room's gravity. The floor tilted sharply, tossing me toward the center drain, and the remaining 23 vault doors along the zinc line flew open with the force of a bomb blast, the heavy iron hinges groaning and snapping like dry kindling. The entire row of iron hatches ripped off their hinges, clattering across the concrete in a chaotic, screaming jumble of metal. The corridor was instantly flooded with that thick, silver-gray fog, and from every single empty vault, I heard the same wet, suctioning, predatory sound of something rising from the abyss. The sub-basement wasn't a storage room anymore, it was an intake manifold, and whatever was living in the deep stone foundation had finally finished priming the pump, eager to drag my screaming, puny life into the endless, crushed dark of the tunnels below. The floor drain beneath my boots began to glow with the same pulsating, silver light, and the vibration grew into a roar, the sound of the university's entire foundation tearing away from the earth as if the ground itself were being ripped open to reveal the festering, mechanical guts of the world. The roar coming out of the foundation wasn't a sudden explosion, boss, it was a deep, structural grinding, the sound of massive limestone blocks shifting and splintering against one another as the earth beneath the sub-basement began to cave inward like a rotting lung. The concrete floorboards cracked wide open right down the center line, a jagged, gaping fissure tearing through the old ceramic drainage channel and sending a spray of sharp, gray stone shrapnel flying through the air like lethal needles. The single yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling finally shattered, its glass popping with a dry, violent snap that left the room plunged into the cold, drilling, malevolent glare of the silver-gray phosphorescence. The silver light was pouring from every open vault now, blindingly bright and thick with the heavy, electric, ozone-choked smell of a lightning strike that had been bottled in a graveyard. The air didn't just smell like ozone anymore, it tasted like bitter, rancid oil, molten burnt copper, and the wet, ancient, suffocating muck of a river bottom that had never known the sun. I was tossed onto my knees, my canvas apron tearing into ribbons against the jagged, razor-like edges of the split concrete as the floor tilted a full 15 degrees toward the center drain, an angle that screamed of total architectural collapse. The drain wasn't just a pipe anymore, boss. The cast iron collar had been completely ripped away by the subterranean pressure, leaving a wide, black, gaping maw in the middle of the room that was actively sucking the warm water, the shattered tile pieces, and the silver, necrotic fog down into a spinning, hydraulic vortex that groaned with the hunger of an underworld god. The suction was immense, a physical, cold hand clawing at the fabric of my work trousers and dragging my boots toward the edge of the pit with a sickening, irresistible force that threatened to pull the very meat from my bones. "Arthur," a voice bellowed through the roar, but it wasn't the supervisor, boss. It was the collective, multi-layered, agonizing rasp of the vaults themselves, echoing up from the spinning drain vortex with a frequency that rattled my teeth and bruised my brain. Asterisk, the fasts are broken. The ledger is clear. Drop the mallet and let the drift take the weight. Asterisk. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my fingers clawing at the rough, slimy, blood-slicked seams of the limestone wall to keep from sliding into the pit. The remaining iron vault doors were spinning across the floorboards like giant, serrated coins, their 3-inch brass levers snapping off against the masonry with loud, metallic cracks that sounded like executioners' pistols in the enclosed, echoing space. Every time a door shattered, the light from the interior shaft grew more intense, turning the swirling, claustrophobic fog into a solid, vibrating wall of silver needles that tore at my eyes and scoured my vision into a bleeding, blurred haze. Through the blinding glare of Vault 14, I saw the first tray begin to slide forward out of the vertical chute. It wasn't carrying a body wrapped in a linen shroud anymore. The zinc frame was completely empty, but the metal itself had warped, its edges curling inward like burning, blistered paper to form a sharp, grotesque, metallic jaw that was snapping rhythmically and hungrily against the stone casing. Asterisk clack. Clack. Clack, asterisk. The metal teeth of the tray were reaching for the main structural columns of the room, grinding into the iron support beams with a screeching, high-pitched violence that sent showers of blinding orange sparks cascading down into the silver, suffocating fog. The entire ceiling began to sag, the heavy joists groaning like tortured giants as the weight of the 3 floors above us settled onto the collapsing, fracturing foundations of the sub-basement. I knew then, boss, that if I didn't reach the manual emergency valve on the central ammonia line, the one bypassed 3 decades ago near the intake ramp, the whole university bunker would drop straight into the deep, crushing earth, burying me alive in a tomb of twisted rebar and cold, indifferent stone before the clock struck 3:15 a.m. My own blood turned to ice in my veins as I realized the silence would never come, only the eternal, rhythmic grinding of the earth as it processed my existence into the ledger's final, unpaid entry. The sagging of those heavy ceiling joists wasn't a gradual settling, boss, it was a sudden, bone-snapping, tectonic drop that brought the main overhead steam pipes down within 3 inches of my skull, a suffocating, crushing weight that turned the room into a lethal cage. The iron brackets holding the utility lines to the limestone gave way with a succession of loud, metallic, tortured snaps, and the pipes began to writhe through the silver fog like dying, thrashing snakes, spitting out high-pressure jets of scalding, superheated water that turned the sub-zero air into a blinding, skin-peeling wall of boiling white mist. The humidity instantly hit my face, searing my cheeks and melting the gray frost that had settled on my eyelashes into a stinging, acidic sludge. I was pinned flat against the base of the wall frame, my bad knee jammed between 2 shifting, grinding limestone blocks that threatened to crush the joint into pulp, the weight of the floor vortex pulling relentlessly at the tail of my heavy canvas apron like 1,000 hungry hands. The suction from the central drain hole was a physical, sadistic gravity now, a howling, brain-scouring, low-frequency roar that filled my ears until they exploded, leaking a thin, warm trail of blood that streamed down my neck. Through the roaring, scald steam and the drilling glare of the silver light, I could see the old emergency ammonia bypass valve at the far end of the intake ramp. It was a massive, 3-foot iron wheel, painted an administrative, soul-deadening lead gray, completely encrusted with 40 years of dry, yellowed sulfur crust and white, jagged needle frost that had never been cleared by the day crews. It was the only thing in the sub-basement that wasn't moving, its heavy structural column anchored deep into the solid limestone section of the foundation that hadn't yet been compromised by the lower, ravenous drift. The line stays fast. I choked out, my voice completely lost in the cacophonous, grinding machinery of the cave-in as I dragged my body forward, inch by agonizing, flesh-tearing inch, along the base of the wall. I didn't have my tools anymore, boss. The rubber mallet and the 16-inch pipe wrench had been sucked down into the vortex 3 minutes ago, swallowed by the black mouth of the drain along with the broken brass safety pins in a display of violent, uncaring consumption. I had to use my bare, trembling hands, my fingers clawing into the narrow, jagged mortar seams of the masonry to haul my shredded torso out of the current of warm, alkaline oil that was now running 4 inches deep across the floorboards, a dark, viscous swamp of chemical waste. Every time I moved my right arm, the nerves in my elbow flared with a sensation like a white-hot wire being pulled through my flesh, the static from that first hatch breach still humming inside my bone marrow like a parasitic, electric infestation. The metal jaw of Vault 14's warp tray gave a final, violent snap, shearing through the secondary iron support column with a sound like a locomotive coupling breaking under a heavy, crushing load of misery. A 300-pound chunk of the stone ceiling crashed down right behind my heels, smashing through the ice sheets and sending a wave of freezing, bone-chilling slush splashing 5 feet into the air, narrowly missing my spine. I reached the intake ramp, my fingers skidding across the slippery, rust-pocked iron of the emergency valve wheel. The metal was sub-zero, so cold that the skin of my palm stuck to the gray paint instantly, tearing raw and bleeding as I forced my remaining, desperate weight against the spokes. The wheel didn't budge, the ancient packing gland was frozen solid by decades of chemical scale, the internal threads locked in a permanent, bureaucratic stasis that defied the shifting, murderous gravity of the room. From the open vertical chutes along the zinc line, the multi-layered rasp grew closer, the sound no longer coming from the deep earth but from the very air inside the mist, a chattering, mocking sound of 64 dead men waiting for me to fail. Asterisk, you're off the clock, Artie. The override is dead. You can't turn the wheel against the weight of 24 volts. Let the ledger drop into the Blackwater ravine. Asterisk. I didn't let go of the spokes. I jammed my left work boot into the rusted teeth of the valve's gear housing, using my leg as a manual, bone-straining lever, and threw my entire chest weight backward into the dark, using the agonizing, violent pull of the floor vortex itself to help me turn the iron wheel. The packing gland gave a sudden, agonizing, screeching protest as the old metal fractured under the manual force of my grip, and the gray wheel began to turn, opening the main pressure vent with a sharp, pneumatic, lung-bursting hiss that shook the very foundation blocks beneath my knees, a final, screaming defiance against the abyss that threatened to consume my soul entirely. The pneumatic hiss coming out of that packing gland wasn't a standard release of air, boss. It was a high-pressure, shriek-filled scream that hit the sub-basement corridor like a mechanical shock wave, threatening to pulverize my eardrums. The gray paint on the emergency wheel blistered and blackened instantly, peeling away from the iron spokes in thin, acrid, smoking curls as the ancient, unvented ammonia reserve from the deep university boiler surged into the secondary bypass lines with the force of a battering ram. The air density inside the room didn't just drop, it skyrocketed, turning the atmosphere into a thick, throat-searing, chemical fog that smelled of pure, raw ammonia and the sweet, sickly rot of a long-dead sewer, stinging my eyes until the jelly of my corneas felt like it was dissolving into salt, forcing me to work completely blind in a dark, acidic shroud. I hung onto the wheel with my raw, skinless palms, my boots swinging clear of the intake ramp as the suction from the floor vortex reached its absolute, catastrophic peak. The gravity of the room was a living, pulsing, sadistic muscle now, trying to yank the 3-foot iron casting, and my body along with it, straight out of its limestone housing with the cruel, indiscriminate intent of a meat grinder. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed piston rhythm inside the open drain hole didn't stop, it accelerated into a continuous, deafening, bone-shattering vibration that ran straight up the steel column of the valve assembly, rattling the bones in my skull until I felt my teeth beginning to loosen and vibrate right out of my bleeding gums. With every stroke of that invisible, Titan engine beneath the earth, the jagged, gaping fissure in the center of the room widened another inch, the concrete floorboard splitting apart with a sound like massive, ancient timber logs snapping and splintering under the crushing weight of a mountain snow. Through the blinding, toxic mist of boiling steam and ammonia frost, I could hear the upper tier of the zinc line beginning to tear itself away from the masonry with the screeching, agonizing sound of tortured metal. The 24-door matrix wasn't just a row of empty lockers anymore, boss. The entire 3-ton iron frame was tilting forward, the top rivets shearing out of the stone with sharp, explosive, metallic reports that echoed like a firing squad through the claustrophobic vault. Asterisk, the valve won't hold it, Artie. Asterisk, the choir of dead throats roared, their voices no longer localized in the drain but vibrating out of the very fabric of my wet, saturated canvas apron, clawing at my sanity. Asterisk, the central header is cracked. You're trying to ledger a flood with a dry pen. Drop the spokes and let the trench equalize. Asterisk. I didn't answer them because I couldn't draw enough unpoisoned, breathable air into my scorched, blackened lungs to shape a single syllable. My chest felt like it was being compressed by an industrial, hydraulic vise, the muscles around my ribs tightening into a single, agonizing, pulsating knot of white-hot agony that threatened to snap my spine like a dry twig. But I knew that if I let go of that will before the bypass line reached full capacity, the back pressure would slam straight into the primary absorption loop, blowing the main boiler headers 3 floors up and dropping the entire, screaming university surgical ward straight down into our faces in a rain of iron and blood. I dug the ragged, worn heel of my left work boot deeper into the gear housing, using the final bit of leverage in my bad, throbbing knee, and gave the gray wheel one last, desperate, soul-shattering wrench to the left. The internal valve stem gave a loud, structural, sickening pop as the remaining thread stripped inside the casing with the finality of a death warrant. The 3-foot iron will spun loose in my grip, and a solid, freezing jet of liquefied ammonia shot through the cracked packing gland like a high-velocity ice lance, hitting my chest with a sub-zero impact that instantly turned the boiling steam on my work shirt into a rigid, impenetrable plate of white, chemical ice that pinned me to the valve column in a tomb of my own making. The sudden, violent temperature drop hit the floor vortex like a physical, godlike barrier, the extreme, killing cold instantly freezing the pools of alkaline oil mid-swirl and locking the cracked, undulating concrete floorboards into a silent, waxy, tomb-like stasis just as the fissure was about to swallow the base of the ramp, leaving me hanging there, shivering and suffocating in the frozen, stinking silence of a half-broken hell. The chemical ice plate on my chest wasn't just a layer of frost, boss, it was a rigid, unyielding armor of frozen ammonia slime that locked my torso into a fixed posture against the valve assembly. The temperature in the immediate perimeter of the intake ramp plummeted 60 degrees in a single second, turning the humid laundry steam into a thick shower of white needle crystals that hissed as they hit my raw, bleeding palms. The sudden transition from scalding heat to absolute, administrative zero hit my central nervous system like a direct short circuit, freezing the blood inside my veins before the pain could even travel up my spine to my brain. I couldn't drop my arms. My fingers were literally glued to the cracked iron spokes of the emergency wheel by the frozen skin of my own palms, my flesh having bonded with the gray zinc paint under the extreme pressure of the sub-zero blast. Through the white fog of chemical crystals, I could see the central drainage vortex had stopped spinning. The 4-inch open maw in the middle of the concrete floorboards was frozen solid, the moving river of alkaline grease turned into a milky, waxy sheet of solid ice that glowed with a faint, dying silver phosphorescence beneath the surface. But the mechanical tension inside the room hadn't receded, boss, it had simply turned static, a massive accumulation of potential energy locked inside the walls like a spring compressed to its absolute limit. The 24-door zinc matrix was still leaning 45 degrees out into the corridor, its 3-ton iron frame hanging by a few remaining rivets that groaned with a high-pitched, metallic screech as the masonry around them crumbled into gray powder. Then, from the deep vertical chute of Vault 14, the final movement began. It wasn't a body sliding out on a tray, and it wasn't the wet suction sound of the canal ghosts climbing the return pipes. The entire interior ceramic lining of the vertical shaft was beginning to slide forward out of the wall, the cylindrical tile casing pushing through the hatch frame like the sleeve of a giant piston. It was a solid column of ancient, unmapped stone, driven from the lower drift by the massive hydraulic backfire I'd caused when I opened the primary bypass line. Hold. I managed to scrape the word out of my throat, though my jaw was so stiff from the ammonia frost that the movement split my bottom lip down to the chin, leaving a trail of dark, frozen blood across the collar of my work shirt. The stone column didn't advance toward me, it aimed straight for the main electrical junction box behind my broken desk, the primary 400-volt distribution panel that controlled the power grid for the entire sub-basement and the research morgues upstairs. The entity inside the wall was trying to complete the circuit with the main university generators, using the solid stone casing as a grounding conduit to blow every electrical breaker in the hospital block. "The line needs to ground, Artie," the multi-layered rasp whispered out of the frozen floor cracks, the sound low, muffled, and incredibly close, as if the throats were buried directly beneath the waxy ice sheets under my boots. Asterisk, the ledger is heavy enough. You can't bolt the panel from the ramp. Let the main switch drop. Asterisk. I didn't have a tool to throw, and I couldn't tear my hands free from the iron spokes without leaving the skin of my palms behind on the valve. I had to use my own body as the manual link. I threw my weight to the left, forcing my frozen hips to pivot against the valve stem, and kicked out with my bad knee, driving the heavy iron heel of my right work boot straight into the primary copper grounding strap that connected the valve housing to the hospital's central water main. The impact was instantaneous and deafening. A massive, blinding arc of blue static electricity shot out of the grounding strap, hitting my leg like a direct lightning strike from a high-voltage transformer. The current tore up my trousers, turning the wet wool into black soot and expanding inside my chest with a concussive force that made every bone in my ribs click like a row of breaking twigs. But the circuit didn't reach the main junction box, it stayed grounded through the iron column of the valve, driving the potential straight down into the bedrock before the stone piston could clear the frame of Vault 14. The blue static arc didn't just scorch my boots, boss, it flipped the entire potential inside the 3-ton iron wall matrix completely on its head. The massive electrical surge that had grounded through my right leg hit the central water main with a resonant, metallic roar that vibrated the limestone foundations 2 floors below the trench. The sudden reversal of the circuit acted like a giant magnetic brake, slamming into the hydraulic pressure of the lower drift with a kinetic force that cracked the remaining ceramic tiles along the zinc line into millions of fine, glittering needles. The change was instantaneous and violent, boss. The moving stone column that was sliding out of Vault 14 froze mid-air, its cylindrical tile casing fracturing down the center with a sound like a heavy artillery shell exploding in an enclosed bunker. The brilliant silver phosphorescence that had been pouring from the 24 open hatches didn't fade, it violently snapped backward into the vertical chutes, collapsing in on itself like an imploding vacuum tube. The blinding glare vanished in a single millisecond, leaving nothing but the deep, suffocating dark of the sub-basement, punctuated only by the faint, dying orange glow of the broken light bulb filament dangling from the ceiling joists. I fell away from the emergency valve wheel, the sudden drop in line pressure releasing the frozen ammonia bond and tearing the raw, blistered skin clean off the palms of my hands. I hit the waxy ice sheets on the floorboards with a heavy, dead thud, my body skidding 3 feet through the chemical slush before my shoulders hit the buckled steel legs of my inspection table. My right leg was completely numb from the hip down, the wool of my trousers charred into flaky black soot that smelled of copper wire and burnt horsehair. Every time I tried to draw a breath, the chemical frost inside my lungs rattled against my ribs with a dry, leathery scrape that tasted like raw iron and carbolic acid. But the howling low-frequency roar from the floor drain was gone, boss. The silence that rushed into the cellar was total, the heavy, plugged quiet that hits an industrial boiler room right after the main steam header drops its pressure line. "The line is isolated," I muttered, my voice sounding like gravel being ground under a heavy boot heel in an empty church. I lay there for what felt like 40 minutes, just watching the ceiling joists through the gray ammonia haze. The extreme sub-zero chill that had turned the warm alkaline oil into solid waxy sheets was slowly equalizing, the natural carbolic cold of the Pennsylvania night returning to its normal, administrative profile. The thick sulfur fog began to thin out, drifting up toward the broken ventilation pipes overhead in slow, natural gray ribbons that didn't hold a silver charge or twist into geometric patterns. Slowly, using my left elbow to drag my torso across the cracked concrete floorboards, I forced my body up to a sitting position. The 24-door matrix was a total ruin, boss. The massive iron frame was still leaning out into the corridor at a dangerous 45-degree angle, held up only by the fractured stone column that had wedged itself into the casing of Vault 14. But the tension was entirely gone from the metal parts. When I reached out with a trembling hand to check the nearest brass handle on Vault 13, the metal wasn't sweating or warm anymore. It was dead cold, solid, and covered in an ordinary layer of white needle frost that didn't bubble or hiss. Inside the open hatches of the upper tier, the zinc transport trays were stationary on their rollers. The river floaters lay flat, heavy, and inert under their wet linen shrouds, their waxy gray limbs resting naturally without any residual static current to twitch the fabric. The entries in the county ledger hadn't been erased, the ink was frozen solid, but the sheets were intact. The circuit had reached absolute zero, and the ledger was balanced for the night. The storm outside had finally spent its fury, boss, leaving nothing but a steady, rhythmic drizzle that dripped off the rusted tin eaves and splashed softly into the coal dust outside the high basement windows. Upstairs, in the main administrative offices of the university building, the heavy municipal lights gave a loud, sudden buzz hum as the auxiliary power grid finally reset its breakers. The overhead fluorescent tubes in the ceiling above me flickered 2 or 3 times, then caught, flooding the sub-basement corridor with a cold, sterile white light that instantly washed out every lingering crimson and silver shadow in the brick corners, leaving the room looking painfully, deceptively vacant, a bleached slaughterhouse waiting for the next intake. The heavy oak doors at the top of the concrete ramp gave a loud, metallic click as the brass deadbolt automatically disengaged, released by the return of the building's normal electrical currents. The shift was officially over. I stood up from my wooden stool, my joints cracking in the cold, and packed my iron wrenches and the warped scraping bar back into the jar of carbolic disinfectant. My right arm was still stiff, the skin numb, mottled, and corpse pale where the blue static had made its final loop, but the fingers were beginning to move again, tingling with a dull, sickening pins and needles warmth that felt like needles of ice being driven into my nerves, a constant reminder of the current I'd dared to touch. I walked over to the heavy oak supply cabinet, my boots cracking through the thin, jagged sheets of chemical ice that remained around the drain casing like broken, yellow teeth. The brass lock was still slightly warm to the touch from the ledger breach, but the metal had hardened back into its official, rigid shape. I turned my brass key in the keyhole, threw the door open, and verified the records. The paper was dry, the blue ink of my signature frozen solid across the bottom line of the intake sheet. Asterisk Tier 3 isolation. All hatches secured and locked according to county code, asterisk. I shut the heavy oak door and turned the key, locking the record away with a definitive, bureaucratic click that echoed cleanly and hollowly off the weeping, sweat-slicked limestone walls, sealing the darkness back into its authorized slot. I walked toward the heavy wooden stairs that led up to the street level, my ruined right boot dragging with a heavy, rhythmic, dead weight scrape against the concrete floorboards, a sound that seemed to taunt the very silence of the room. My bad knee was throbbing with every step, a hot, stabbing agony, and my canvas apron was heavily stained with a nauseating mixture of iridescent silver oil, charred human grease, and burnt rubber, a toxic patina of my service to the dead. The air in the trench felt normal now, just the old, stagnant, suffocating smell of damp limestone, floor wax, and autumn rain. As I reached the top step and placed my palm against the iron latch of the exit door, I stopped and looked down one last time through the wooden railings at the empty, gaping zinc line below. The prep room looked clean under the sterile white glare of the fluorescent tubes, almost ordinary, like a place where nothing but mundane paperwork and slabs of cold, unthinking meat ever changed hands. But let me tell you something, boss. When you spend your nights fastening the hatches of the dead in a valley like this, you learn that every old, crumbling building in Pennsylvania is just a cannibalistic engine built over a massive, unmapped graveyard of broken spirits. Every county town has a forgotten valve, an abandoned shaft, or a buried, pulsing circuit waiting just beneath the concrete floorboards, starving for a pulse to consume. And sooner or later, when the rain hits the right, discordant cadence and the pressure begins to build in the suffocating dark, the line always finds a way to ground itself right through the living, searing itself into your marrow until you realize that you aren't leaving the basement at all, you're just carrying the cold, grinding machinery of the abyss home inside your own skin, where it will keep ticking, keep hungry, and keep waiting for the next time the power flickers and the locks begin to weep, ensuring that your own heartbeat becomes nothing more than a rhythmic, final count in the ledger of the damned.